Sarah Martinez vanished on October 16, 1996, while she was conducting her routine evening check of the Millbrook Family Shelter in rural Pennsylvania. She had been the shelter's director for 3 years, a position she took after completing her social work degree at Penn State University. That Tuesday evening, security cameras captured her walking through the main hallway at exactly 9:47 p.m., clipboard in hand, making sure all the residents were settled for the night. By dawn the next morning, Sarah, along with 22 other people living at the shelter, had simply disappeared without leaving behind a single clue about where they had gone or why they had left so suddenly. The Millbrook Family Shelter sat on the outskirts of town, a converted Victorian mansion that had once belonged to a wealthy coal mining family in the early 1900s. The 3-story building had been transformed into temporary housing for families experiencing difficult times, providing a safe haven for those who had nowhere else to turn. The shelter could accommodate up to 15 families at any given time, with communal areas on the first floor, including a kitchen, dining room, children's playroom, and administrative offices. The second and third floors housed individual family units, each equipped with basic furniture and privacy that many of the residents had not experienced in months or even years. Sarah had always been passionate about helping others, a trait that her colleagues at the County Social Services Department noticed immediately when she first applied for the position. She grew up in a middle-class family in nearby Harrisburg, where her parents ran a small grocery store that served the local community for over 30 years. Her childhood experiences watching her parents extend credit to struggling families during tough economic times had shaped her understanding of how quickly circumstances could change for ordinary people. After graduating with honors from Penn State, she specifically sought opportunities to work directly with families in crisis, believing that temporary assistance could make the difference between someone getting back on their feet or falling into long-term dependency on social services. The economic situation in Millbrook County during the mid-1990s was particularly challenging for working-class families. The region had relied heavily on manufacturing and coal mining for generations, but by the 1990s, many of these industries were either downsizing significantly or closing operations entirely. The unemployment rate in the county hovered around 12%, nearly double the national average, and many families found themselves facing foreclosure or eviction, despite having steady employment histories spanning decades. The shelter served as a crucial resource for these families, providing not just temporary housing, but also assistance with job placement, child care arrangements, and connections to other social services that could help them achieve long-term stability. Detective Ray Thompson was 28 years old in 1996 and had been working for the Millbrook County Sheriff's Department for just under 4 years. He had grown up in the area and returned after completing his criminal justice degree at Indiana University of Pennsylvania, motivated by a desire to serve the community where he had been raised. Thompson was known among his colleagues for his methodical approach to investigations and his ability to connect with people from all walks of life, skills that would prove invaluable in the years to come. On the morning of October 17, 1996, he received what initially seemed like a routine call about a possible break-in at the family shelter, but within hours, he would find himself at the center of one of the most perplexing cases in the county's history. The families living at the Millbrook shelter in October 1996 represented a cross-section of the economic struggles facing rural Pennsylvania at that time. There was Maria Gonzalez, a single mother of 2 young children who had been working at a textile factory until it closed suddenly, leaving her unable to afford rent on her apartment. The Johnson family had been staying at the shelter for 6 weeks after a house fire destroyed their mobile home, and they discovered their insurance coverage was insufficient to secure new housing immediately. Robert Chen, a recent engineering graduate, was temporarily staying at the shelter with his wife and infant daughter while searching for employment in his field, having exhausted his savings during a prolonged job search that had stretched much longer than anticipated. Each family had their own story of how they had arrived at the shelter, but they shared common experiences of economic uncertainty and the stress that comes with not knowing where you might be living from one month to the next. Despite these challenges, the atmosphere at the shelter was generally positive, with residents often helping each other with child care, job search activities, and emotional support. Sarah had worked hard to create an environment where families felt dignified, rather than ashamed about needing temporary assistance, organizing community meals, educational workshops, and children's activities that helped maintain a sense of normalcy during a difficult time. The daily routine at the shelter followed a structured schedule designed to balance the needs of individual families with the practical requirements of operating a communal living facility. Residents were expected to contribute to common area maintenance, participate in weekly house meetings, and work with shelter staff to develop action plans for achieving independent housing. Children attended local schools, and the shelter provided transportation when needed. Adults were required to spend at least 30 hours per week on employment-related activities, whether that meant working at jobs they had managed to secure, attending job interviews, or participating in skills training programs offered through partnerships with local community colleges and vocational schools. Sarah typically arrived at the shelter each morning around 7:30, about an hour before most residents began their daily routines. She used this quiet time to review case files, prepare for meetings with social service agencies, and handle administrative tasks that required concentration. Her office was located on the first floor, next to the main entrance, and had large windows that allowed her to observe the comings and goings throughout the day. Residents often stopped by her office to discuss concerns, share good news about job prospects, or simply to chat about how their children were adjusting to their new schools. Sarah maintained an open-door policy and was known for her ability to listen without judgment while offering practical advice and emotional support. The funding for the Millbrook Family Shelter came from a combination of federal grants, state social service allocations, and private donations from local churches and community organizations. Sarah spent considerable time each month managing the complex paperwork required to maintain these funding streams, ensuring that the shelter remained in compliance with various regulations and reporting requirements. The financial situation was often precarious, with budget shortfalls requiring creative solutions and constant advocacy for additional resources. Despite these challenges, Sarah had successfully maintained full operation of the shelter throughout her tenure, even managing to implement several improvements, including a computer lab where residents could develop job skills and search for employment opportunities online. The building itself required constant maintenance, given its age and the heavy use it received from multiple families living there simultaneously. The heating system was particularly problematic during Pennsylvania winters, and Sarah had become skilled at working with local contractors to address issues quickly and cost-effectively. The shelter's kitchen served 3 communal meals per day, and Sarah often found herself helping with meal preparation and cleanup, viewing these activities as opportunities to connect with residents and stay informed about any concerns or conflicts that might be developing within the community. October 15, 1996 had been a particularly busy day at the shelter, with 2 new families moving in, and one family celebrating the news that they had secured both employment and independent housing, allowing them to move out by the end of the month. Sarah had spent much of the afternoon helping the new arrivals get settled, explaining shelter rules and procedures, and connecting them with relevant social services. The evening had proceeded normally, with dinner served at 6 o'clock, followed by homework time for the children and a brief house meeting to discuss upcoming activities and address any concerns residents wanted to raise with shelter management. By 9 o'clock that evening, most of the children were in bed, and adults were settling into their evening routines. Some residents gathered in the common area to watch television or play card games, while others retreated to their individual family spaces to read, write letters, or prepare for job interviews scheduled for the following day. Sarah completed her routine evening documentation, updating case files and preparing notes for meetings scheduled for later in the week. The building had a peaceful atmosphere that evening, with no unusual incidents or concerns that required her immediate attention. The security system at the shelter included cameras positioned at the main entrance, in common areas, and in the hallways on each floor. The system was relatively basic by today's standards, recording onto VHS tapes that were changed weekly and stored in Sarah's office. The cameras served primarily as a deterrent to any potential problems and provided a record of activities that could be reviewed if questions arose about incidents or policy violations. On the evening of October 15th, the cameras functioned normally, capturing routine activities throughout the building as residents went about their evening routines and prepared for another night's rest. When morning came on October 16th, the silence was the first thing that seemed unusual to neighbors and passers-by. Typically, the shelter showed signs of life by 6:30 in the morning, with lights in the kitchen and dining areas as breakfast preparation began. Children could usually be heard playing in the yard before school, and adults often gathered on the front porch to drink coffee and discuss their plans for the day. But on that Wednesday morning, the building remained dark and quiet, with no signs of the usual morning activity that had become part of the neighborhood's daily rhythm. The mystery of what happened at the Millbrook Family Shelter would captivate the local community and law enforcement for decades to come, becoming one of those cases that investigators never quite manage to forget, even as years pass and other cases demand their attention. The disappearance of 23 people, including Sarah Martinez and all of the families she had been working so hard to help, would challenge everything that Detective Ray Thompson thought he understood about conducting thorough investigations and finding answers to even the most puzzling questions. Detective Ray Thompson arrived at the Millbrook Family Shelter at 8:42 a.m. on October 16, 1996, expecting to investigate what the dispatcher had described as a possible burglary. The call had come from Mrs. Eleanor Hendricks, an elderly neighbor who lived across the street and had grown accustomed to the daily rhythms of the shelter over the past 3 years. She had become concerned when she noticed that no lights had come on in the building that morning, and no children had emerged to wait for the school bus, as they did every weekday. When Thompson pulled up to the Victorian mansion, the first thing that struck him was the complete stillness of the place, a stark contrast to the bustling activity he had observed during previous visits to the shelter for routine community policing duties. The front door was unlocked, which immediately seemed unusual given the security protocols that shelters typically maintained. Thompson called out as he entered the building, announcing his presence and asking if anyone needed assistance. The silence that greeted him was profound and unsettling. The main hallway showed no signs of disturbance, with furniture in its proper place, and no indication that any struggle or hurried departure had occurred. Personal belongings remained throughout the building exactly where residents had left them the night before. Children's toys were scattered in the playroom, half-finished homework assignments lay on the dining room table, and coffee cups sat in the kitchen sink, still containing the remnants of what appeared to be the previous evening's final hot beverages. Thompson methodically searched each room in the building, documenting what he found with the thoroughness that would later prove crucial to understanding the scope of this mystery. In the administrative office, Sarah Martinez's purse sat in the bottom drawer of her desk, containing her wallet with credit cards, driver's license, and $63 in cash. Her car keys hung on the hook beside her office door, and her vehicle remained parked in its designated spot in the small lot behind the building. The registration book showed that 22 residents had been present the night before, including 7 adults and 15 children ranging in age from 8 months to 16 years old. The individual family units on the second and third floors told stories of lives interrupted mid-routine. In room 2A, Maria Gonzalez's work uniform for her new job at a local restaurant hung freshly laundered on the closet door, ready for her shift that was scheduled to begin at 11 o'clock that morning. Her 2 children's school backpacks sat by the door, packed and ready for another day of classes. In room 2C, the Johnson family's temporary living space showed evidence of their evening routine, with medications laid out on the nightstand and a partially completed job application for a construction position that Robert Johnson had planned to submit that morning. The Chen family's room on the 3rd floor contained engineering textbooks that Robert Chen had borrowed from the local library, along with detailed notes about potential career opportunities he had researched in neighboring counties. His wife's sewing project, a small blanket for their infant daughter, remained stretched across a makeshift work area, with the needle still threaded and ready for the next stitch. These intimate details of interrupted lives created an atmosphere that Thompson would later describe as more unsettling than any crime scene he had encountered during his law enforcement career. By noon on October 16th, Thompson had contacted the Pennsylvania State Police and requested assistance with what had clearly become a missing persons case involving 23 individuals. The scale of simultaneous disappearances was unprecedented in the region, and local law enforcement resources were insufficient to handle the investigation that would be required. State Police Detective Lieutenant Maria Santos arrived that afternoon with a team of investigators and crime scene technicians who began the painstaking process of documenting every detail of the abandoned shelter. The security video system yielded both crucial information and frustrating gaps that would plague the investigation for years to come. The cameras had functioned normally until approximately 10:15 p.m. on October 15th, when the recording suddenly became corrupted with static and interference that made it impossible to discern any activities or movements. The corruption affected all cameras simultaneously, suggesting either a deliberate act of sabotage or a systematic technical failure that investigators could never definitively explain. The last clear images showed residents engaged in typical evening activities, with no signs of distress or unusual behavior that might have foreshadowed the events that followed. News of the mass disappearance spread quickly throughout Millbrook County and beyond, creating a media sensation that brought unprecedented attention to the small rural community. Local television stations began broadcasting continuous coverage of the investigation, and newspaper reporters from Pittsburgh and Philadelphia arrived to cover the story. The Pennsylvania State Police established a temporary command center in the town hall, and a hotline was set up to receive tips from the public. Within the first week, investigators had received over 400 calls from people claiming to have information about the missing families, though most of these leads proved to be false sightings or speculation rather than substantive evidence. The impact on the local community was immediate and profound. Parents became reluctant to let their children walk to school alone, and many residents began locking doors that had remained unlocked for generations. The economic implications were also significant, as the shelter had been a major source of federal and state funding flowing into the county, and its sudden closure eliminated several jobs while also removing a crucial resource for families experiencing financial difficulties. Local churches and community organizations attempted to fill some of the gap, but they lacked the resources and infrastructure to provide the comprehensive services that the shelter had offered. Detective Thompson found himself working 18-hour days as the investigation expanded to include multiple law enforcement agencies and specialized units. The Federal Bureau of Investigation became involved due to the possibility that the disappearances might be related to human trafficking or other federal crimes, though agents remained skeptical about devoting significant resources to a case with so little physical evidence. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit created profiles of the missing individuals, looking for common factors that might explain why this particular group had vanished together. Financial investigations revealed some irregularities in the shelter's funding that added new layers of complexity to the case. Records showed that the facility had received several large grants from federal programs designed to support transitional housing initiatives, but documentation of how these funds had been allocated was incomplete. Sarah Martinez had been meticulous about maintaining resident files and daily operation records, but her financial management systems were less organized, possibly due to the overwhelming administrative burden she faced as the shelter's sole full-time employee. Investigators discovered that significant amounts of money had been transferred to accounts that could not be immediately traced, though there was no clear evidence that these transactions were connected to the disappearances. The search for the missing families expanded to include surrounding states, as investigators considered the possibility that the group had been transported far from the original location. Law enforcement agencies in Ohio, West Virginia, Maryland, and New York were provided with photographs and descriptions of all 23 missing individuals. Bus stations, airports, and train terminals throughout the region were canvassed for any record of tickets purchased or suspicious activities observed around the time of the disappearances. Despite these extensive efforts, no credible sightings or physical evidence emerged to indicate the direction in which the missing people might have traveled. As weeks turned into months, the investigation began to shift from an active search and rescue operation to a long-term missing persons case. The initial urgency that had driven round-the-clock investigative efforts gradually gave way to the reality that solving this mystery would require sustained effort over an extended period. Detective Thompson continued to follow leads and conduct interviews, but the caseload of the sheriff's department meant that he could not devote his entire attention to the shelter disappearances indefinitely. The families of the missing individuals faced the particular agony of not knowing whether their loved ones were alive or dead, safe or in danger. Maria Gonzalez's mother traveled from Puerto Rico to Pennsylvania, hoping to find some trace of her daughter and grandchildren. She remained in the area for 6 months, working with local Spanish-speaking churches to distribute flyers and organize prayer vigils. The emotional toll on these extended family members was enormous, compounded by their inability to access victim services or support programs designed for families of crime victims, since no crime had been definitively established. Media coverage of the case gradually diminished as other stories captured public attention, but the mystery continued to resonate throughout central Pennsylvania. Local urban legends began to develop around the empty shelter building, with some residents claiming to have seen lights in the windows or heard children playing in the yard during the early morning hours. The building's owner, faced with ongoing mortgage payments and no rental income, eventually allowed the property to fall into foreclosure, and by 1999, the structure had begun showing signs of deterioration due to lack of maintenance. Professional investigators who worked on the case developed various theories about what might have happened to the missing families. Some believed that the group had been relocated as part of a witness protection program, possibly after discovering criminal activities that put them in danger. Others suspected that human trafficking organizations had targeted the shelter because of the vulnerable population it served, though the complete absence of evidence supporting this theory made it difficult to pursue. A smaller group of investigators theorized that the families had disappeared voluntarily, perhaps with assistance from underground networks designed to help people escape domestic violence or debt collection, though this explanation struggled to account for why families without apparent reasons to flee would abandon their belongings and established routines. The psychological impact on Detective Thompson was significant and lasting. He had entered law enforcement with confidence that careful investigation and logical reasoning could solve most criminal cases, but the shelter disappearances challenged his fundamental assumptions about how evidence-based police work should function. He began experiencing sleep difficulties and anxiety attacks, particularly when working on other missing persons cases that reminded him of his inability to find answers for the 23 individuals who had vanished from his jurisdiction. His marriage suffered strain as he became increasingly obsessed with reviewing case files and pursuing leads that his colleagues viewed as unlikely to produce results. By 2000, the active investigation had been scaled back to periodic reviews of the case file and follow-up on occasional tips that continued to come in from the public. The Pennsylvania State Police maintained the case in their open files, and the FBI kept profiles of the missing individuals in national databases, but no new investigative resources were allocated to the shelter disappearances. Detective Thompson continued to work other cases for the Millbrook County Sheriff's Department, but colleagues noted that he never seemed to fully move past the unsolved mystery that had defined his early career. The economic and social changes that swept through rural Pennsylvania in the early 2000s meant that the need for transitional housing services remained acute, but no organization stepped forward to reopen a facility comparable to the Millbrook Family Shelter. The building sat empty for years, gradually becoming a symbol of the community's inability to understand what had happened to people who had simply been seeking temporary assistance during difficult times in their lives. As Detective Thompson advanced in his career, eventually becoming the senior investigator for the Sheriff's Department, he maintained detailed files on the shelter case and continued to hope that new evidence or investigative techniques might eventually provide answers. He never spoke publicly about his frustration with the case, but colleagues knew that he kept photographs of all 23 missing individuals in his desk drawer, and he made sure that their disappearances were included in annual training sessions for new deputies who joined the department. The mystery remained a defining unsolved case for law enforcement in central Pennsylvania, representing not just the disappearance of 23 people, but also the limits of conventional investigative approaches when faced with cases that seemed to defy logical explanation through traditional evidence gathering and analysis techniques. 20 years after the disappearance at the Millbrook Family Shelter, Detective Ray Thompson had become a weathered veteran of the Sheriff's Department, carrying the weight of numerous solved and unsolved cases throughout his career. On a cold February morning in 2016, his phone rang at 6:30 a.m. with a call that would resurrect the most haunting mystery of his professional life. The voice on the other end belonged to Jake Morrison, a construction foreman working on a renovation project at the old shelter property, which had recently been purchased by a local developer planning to convert the Victorian mansion into luxury apartments. Morrison's crew had been working on foundation repairs when they discovered what appeared to be a hidden room beneath the building's basement. The construction workers had noticed that one section of the basement wall sounded hollow when struck, and further investigation revealed a concealed entrance behind what looked like a solid stone foundation wall. When they managed to break through, they found a carefully constructed underground space that had been completely hidden from view for decades. The room was approximately 12 feet by 20 feet, with reinforced concrete walls and a ventilation system that connected to the building's main air circulation network. Thompson arrived at the construction site within an hour of receiving the call, accompanied by crime scene technicians and representatives from the Pennsylvania State Police, who had maintained jurisdiction over the original missing persons case. What they found in the hidden room would provide the first substantial breakthrough in the investigation, but it would also raise new questions that were even more disturbing than the original mystery of the mass disappearance. The room appeared to have been carefully prepared for long-term habitation, with electrical wiring that connected to the building's main power grid and a sophisticated air filtration system that would have allowed people to remain underground for extended periods without detection. The underground space showed signs of meticulous planning and construction that suggested it had been built specifically to house the shelter residents during an emergency situation. The walls were lined with sound-dampening materials that would have prevented any noise from escaping to the surface, and the floor was covered with industrial carpeting that had been designed to provide comfort for people who might need to remain in the space for weeks or months. Storage areas along the walls contained preserved food supplies, medical equipment, and basic household items that would have been necessary for sustaining a group of people in isolation. The underground room had clearly been inhabited for an extended period. Along one wall, investigators found makeshift sleeping areas with blankets and pillows that showed signs of long-term use. A small table held personal items including jewelry, photographs, and handwritten letters that could be immediately identified as belonging to several of the families who had disappeared in 1996. Most significantly, they discovered a cache of documents that included detailed records of financial transactions, correspondence with government agencies, and what appeared to be evidence of a complex scheme involving the misuse of federal funding intended for social services. Among the most shocking discoveries was a series of journals written by Sarah Martinez during the weeks leading up to the October 1996 disappearances. The entries revealed that she had uncovered serious financial irregularities in the shelter's funding and had been investigating connections between local officials and federal programs designed to support transitional housing initiatives. Her final entries described receiving threats and expressed fear for the safety of the families under her care. The last entry, dated October 14, 1996, indicated that she had arranged for the families to be moved to a secure location while she gathered evidence to present to federal authorities. The journals painted a disturbing picture of Sarah Martinez's final weeks at the shelter. She had begun noticing discrepancies in federal funding reports in August 1996, when routine paperwork revealed that the shelter was being credited with serving significantly more families than were actually residing there. Her initial inquiries to county officials about these discrepancies had been met with vague explanations about administrative errors and reassurances that the issues would be corrected. However, as Sarah dug deeper into the financial records, she discovered that the problem was much more extensive than simple bookkeeping mistakes. Sarah's investigation had revealed that false documentation was being submitted to federal agencies, claiming that the Millbrook shelter was housing up to 40 families at any given time, when the actual capacity was only 15 families and the typical occupancy was closer to 10 families. The fraudulent reports allowed corrupt officials to claim reimbursement for services that were never provided, while the excess funding was being diverted to personal accounts and shell companies controlled by individuals in positions of authority within the county government. The documents found in the hidden room painted a picture of systematic corruption involving multiple levels of government and private contractors. Federal grants intended to support homeless families had been diverted through a network of shell companies and fraudulent organizations, The Millbrook Family Shelter had become inadvertently involved when Sarah Martinez began questioning discrepancies in funding allocations and discovered that several other shelters throughout Pennsylvania were reporting services to non-existent clients while billing federal programs for millions of dollars in fraudulent expenses. Sarah's journals revealed that she had contacted the FBI field office in Philadelphia in early September 1996, providing detailed documentation of her findings to Special Agent Catherine Reynolds, who had been investigating similar financial irregularities in social service programs throughout the region. Agent Reynolds had advised Sarah to continue documenting evidence while maintaining normal operations at the shelter, but to avoid confronting local officials directly until federal investigators could determine the full scope of the corruption network. The complexity of the fraud scheme became apparent as investigators examined the documents found in the hidden room. The corruption network had created an elaborate system of false documentation that included fabricated client intake forms, fictional case management records, and forged signatures on official documents. The scheme had been operating for at least 5 years before Sarah Martinez discovered the irregularities, during which time millions of dollars in federal funding had been diverted from programs intended to help vulnerable families. Detective Thompson, now 48 years old and serving as the department's senior investigator, found himself working closely with FBI agents who had specialized expertise in financial crimes and public corruption cases. Agent Reynolds, now retired but brought back as a consultant on the case, confirmed that Sarah Martinez had been providing crucial intelligence about the corruption scheme and that her safety had become a serious concern when local officials began pressuring her to stop asking questions about funding discrepancies. The federal involvement was necessary because the evidence suggested that the 1996 disappearances were connected to a much larger criminal enterprise that had operated across multiple states for several years. The investigation expanded to include financial records from dozens of organizations and government agencies, requiring resources and expertise that local law enforcement could not provide independently. The corruption network had been sophisticated in its operations, using legitimate social service organizations as fronts, while systematically diverting federal funds through a complex web of subsidiary companies and consulting agreements. Agent Reynolds explained to Thompson that the federal investigation had been proceeding carefully and methodically throughout 1996, with agents working to identify all participants in the corruption network before making arrests that might alert other conspirators. The sudden escalation of threats against Sarah Martinez and the shelter residents had forced investigators to implement emergency protective measures that disrupted the careful timeline of their investigation. The decision to evacuate the families immediately had been made when surveillance indicated that individuals connected to the corruption scheme were planning to take direct action against the shelter. Further exploration of the hidden room revealed that it had been used as a temporary safe house for the missing families, while arrangements were made for their permanent relocation. Investigators found evidence that the 23 individuals had remained in the underground space for approximately 2 weeks after their initial disappearance, during which time new identities and living situations were being arranged through what appeared to be an unofficial witness protection program operated outside normal federal channels. The room contained a sophisticated communication system that had allowed the hidden families to maintain contact with federal investigators while remaining completely concealed from local law enforcement and potentially corrupt officials. A two-way radio system connected to an external antenna hidden in the building's roof structure had provided secure communication channels that could not be monitored by conventional surveillance equipment. Food and supplies had been delivered through a separate entrance that connected to the building's utility room, allowing regular resupply without any visible activity that might have attracted attention from neighbors or law enforcement. The hidden entrance to the underground room had been accessed through a concealed panel in the utility room that appeared to be part of the building's original construction. The panel could only be opened using a specific sequence of operations that involved manipulating seemingly unrelated fixtures and controls throughout the basement area. This sophisticated security system suggested that the underground space had been planned and constructed by individuals with extensive knowledge of building design and security protocols. The journals and documents indicated that Sarah Martinez had been working with a network of social workers, law enforcement officers, and federal investigators who had been building a case against the corruption scheme for months before the October 1996 incident. When threats against the shelter residents escalated, the decision was made to evacuate everyone immediately and place them in protective custody while the investigation continued. The operation had been conducted in complete secrecy to prevent interference from corrupt officials who were suspected of having connections to local law enforcement agencies. Thompson's investigation revealed that at least 18 of the missing individuals were still alive and living under new identities in various states throughout the country. The FBI's witness protection specialists had worked with other federal agencies to provide new social security numbers, identification documents, and financial assistance to help the families establish new lives far from Pennsylvania. The children, now adults, had grown up believing that their families had been relocated for their own safety, though many had never been told the complete truth about why they had been forced to abandon their previous lives so suddenly. The process of relocating the families had been complex and expensive, requiring coordination between multiple federal agencies and the creation of detailed background stories that would allow the relocated individuals to integrate into new communities without arousing suspicion. Each family had been provided with housing, employment assistance, and educational support to help them rebuild their lives in their new locations. The children had been enrolled in schools under their new identities, and adults had received job training and placement services to help them achieve economic stability. The adult residents had been informed about the broader context of their situation, but they had been required to sign agreements prohibiting them from contacting anyone from their previous lives or returning to Pennsylvania without explicit permission from federal authorities. Maria Gonzalez had been relocated to Oregon, where she eventually completed nursing school and raised her children as a single mother. Her daughter, now 28 years old, had become a teacher and was married with children of her own. Her son had followed his mother's path into healthcare, working as a physical therapist in Portland. Maria's experience in Oregon had been challenging but ultimately successful. The federal relocation program had provided her with temporary housing and financial assistance while she completed her nursing education, but the emotional toll of maintaining a secret identity while building a new life had been enormous. She had struggled with depression and anxiety for several years after the relocation, requiring ongoing counseling and support from federal caseworkers who specialized in helping relocated witnesses adjust to their new circumstances. The Johnson family had been moved to Arizona, where Robert found work in construction, and his wife started a small business providing child care services for other working families. Their economic situation had improved significantly in their new location, and by 2016, they owned their own home and had become active members of their community. However, the stress of maintaining their secret identities had taken a toll on their marriage, and they had divorced in 2008, though they remained committed to co-parenting their children and maintaining the security protocols that protected their new identities. Robert Johnson had found the transition to Arizona particularly difficult because his construction skills were well suited to the booming housing market in the Phoenix area, but he had been required to provide false employment history and references that made it challenging to secure positions commensurate with his experience and abilities. Over time, he had built a successful career with a large construction company, eventually becoming a project supervisor responsible for overseeing residential developments throughout the region. Robert Chen and his family had been relocated to North Carolina, where his engineering background helped him secure employment with a technology company that was experiencing rapid growth during the late 1990s. His career had flourished in his new location, and by 2016, he had become a senior manager overseeing large-scale infrastructure projects. His wife had completed a degree in computer science and had established a successful consulting practice specializing in database management for small businesses. Their daughter, who had been an infant when they disappeared from Pennsylvania, had grown up to become a successful college student studying environmental science. The Chen family's relocation had been particularly successful from an economic standpoint, as Robert's engineering skills were in high demand in North Carolina's growing technology sector. However, the family had struggled with the social isolation that came with maintaining false identities, and being unable to form deep friendships with colleagues and neighbors who might ask too many questions about their background. Their daughter had grown up knowing that her family's history was different from those around her, but she had not learned the complete truth about their relocation until she reached adulthood. The corruption scheme that had prompted the 1996 relocations had involved a sophisticated network of individuals, including county commissioners, state officials, federal program administrators, and private contractors, who had been systematically defrauding social service programs for nearly a decade. The investigation that Sarah Martinez had stumbled upon was part of a larger federal operation that had been building cases against dozens of individuals throughout Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia. The sudden discovery of the scheme by an outsider had forced federal investigators to accelerate their timeline and implement emergency protective measures for anyone who might have evidence of the criminal activities. The corruption network had been led by County Commissioner Harold Brennan, who had used his position to influence the allocation of federal funding to organizations that he secretly controlled through a network of family members and business associates. Brennan had been working with State Social Services Administrator Margaret Walsh to manipulate funding formulas and reporting requirements that allowed fraudulent organizations to receive millions of dollars in federal grants without providing the services they claimed to be delivering. Thompson learned that several of the key figures in the corruption network had been prosecuted and convicted during the late 1990s and early 2000s, though these cases had received minimal media attention and had been presented as isolated incidents of financial fraud rather than parts of a coordinated criminal enterprise. County Commissioner Harold Brennan had been sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for conspiracy and fraud charges related to the diversion of housing assistance funds. State official Margaret Walsh had received a 6-year sentence for her role in facilitating the fraudulent billing schemes. Several private contractors had also been convicted and sentenced to various terms of imprisonment. The prosecutions had been carefully orchestrated to avoid revealing the connection to the shelter disappearances, with federal prosecutors presenting the cases as separate investigations into financial fraud rather than as part of a broader witness protection operation. This approach had allowed investigators to secure convictions while maintaining the security of the relocated families, but it had also meant that the public never understood the full scope of the criminal enterprise or the courage that ordinary citizens had shown in helping to expose the corruption. The public had never been informed about the connection between these prosecutions and the disappearance of the shelter families, partly because revealing this information would have compromised the safety of individuals who were living under protected identities. The federal prosecutors had made a strategic decision to treat the corruption cases as separate from the witness protection operation, allowing them to secure convictions while maintaining the security of the relocated families. The investigation also revealed tragic information about some of the missing individuals who had not survived the intervening 20 years. 3 of the adults had passed away from natural causes, and their deaths had been officially recorded under their new identities without any connection to their previous lives in Pennsylvania. 2 of the children had faced significant challenges adjusting to their new circumstances. One had struggled with substance dependency issues that eventually led to serious health complications, though he had ultimately recovered and was working as a counselor, helping others with similar challenges. The deaths of the relocated individuals had created additional complications for federal authorities, who had been required to maintain the fiction of their new identities, even in death, while also ensuring that their families received appropriate support and benefits. In some cases, extended family members who had never stopped searching for their missing relatives were unaware that their loved ones had passed away, creating ongoing emotional distress for people who continued to hope for eventual reunions. Sarah Martinez herself had been relocated to Colorado, where she had continued working in social services under her new identity. She had eventually married a fellow social worker and had 2 children of her own. However, the stress of maintaining her secret identity while working in a field that reminded her daily of the events that had forced her to abandon her previous life had led to periods of depression and anxiety that required ongoing professional treatment. Despite these challenges, she had built a successful career and had become a respected advocate for improvements in social service funding oversight. Sarah's work in Colorado had been particularly meaningful to her because she had been able to use her experience with the corruption in Pennsylvania to help identify and prevent similar schemes in her new state. She had become an expert in financial oversight and fraud prevention, working with state and federal agencies to develop better monitoring systems for social service programs. However, she had never been able to publicly discuss the experiences that had given her this expertise, which had been a source of ongoing frustration and isolation. As Thompson worked to piece together the complete story of what had happened in 1996, he found himself grappling with complex emotions about the case that had defined his early career. On one hand, he felt relief and satisfaction in learning that most of the missing individuals had survived and had been living safe, productive lives for the past 20 years. On the other hand, he experienced anger and frustration about the deception that had been necessary to protect these families, and about his own department's inability to solve a case that had haunted the local community for 2 decades. Thompson's emotional response to the resolution of the case was complicated by his recognition that the federal authorities had been forced to make difficult decisions under challenging circumstances. While he understood the necessity of protecting the relocated families, he also felt that better communication with local law enforcement might have been possible without compromising security. The revelation that his investigation had been proceeding parallel to a federal operation without his knowledge had challenged his assumptions about interagency cooperation and information sharing. The FBI agents working on the case explained that the secrecy surrounding the 1996 relocations had been necessary to prevent retaliation against the families and to protect the ongoing investigation into the corruption network. However, they acknowledged that the emotional cost to family members who had spent 20 years wondering about the fate of their loved ones had been enormous, and that better communication might have been possible if the case had been handled differently. Agent Reynolds admitted that the decision to maintain complete secrecy had been controversial, even within federal law enforcement circles, but that the perceived threat to the families had been considered too serious to risk any potential security breaches. The federal authorities explained that the corruption network had included individuals with connections to law enforcement agencies at multiple levels, making it impossible to determine which local officials could be trusted with information about the witness protection operation. The decision to maintain complete secrecy had been based on intelligence suggesting that corrupt officials were monitoring police communications and had access to sensitive information about ongoing investigations. Thompson was able to facilitate contact between some of the relocated families and their extended relatives who had never stopped hoping for news about their missing loved ones. Maria Gonzalez was reunited with her mother, now in her 80s, who had maintained a shrine in her Puerto Rican home with photographs and mementos from her daughter and grandchildren. The emotional reunion, conducted under careful security protocols, provided closure for family members who had grieved for 20 years without knowing whether their relatives were alive or dead. The reunion took place at a secure federal facility in Virginia, with extensive security measures to ensure that the meeting could not be observed or recorded by anyone outside the immediate family and federal protective services. Maria's mother, Rosa Gonzalez, had flown from Puerto Rico with the assistance of federal agents who had arranged her travel and accommodations. The meeting was emotional and difficult, with both women struggling to process 20 years of separation and the circumstances that had made it necessary. Rosa Gonzalez had spent 20 years believing that her daughter and grandchildren might be dead, and the revelation that they had been alive and safe throughout this period created a complex mixture of relief, joy, and anger about the deception that had been necessary. The reunion had been facilitated by federal counselors who specialized in helping families navigate the unique emotional challenges associated with witness protection programs, and ongoing support services were provided to help both women adjust to their new relationship. The revelation about the hidden room and the true fate of the missing families created a media sensation that far exceeded the original coverage of the 1996 disappearances. National news organizations picked up the story, focusing on themes of government corruption, witness protection, and the sacrifice that ordinary families had made to help expose criminal activities. The coverage also raised questions about the effectiveness of official witness protection programs and whether alternative approaches might have been less traumatic for the families involved. The media attention created additional challenges for the relocated families, many of whom had built successful lives under their new identities and were concerned about how the publicity might affect their careers, their children's futures, and their safety. Federal authorities worked with each family individually to assess their security needs and to provide support for managing the transition to a more open existence after 20 years of carefully maintained secrecy. Local officials in Millbrook County found themselves defending their handling of the original investigation, though Thompson publicly acknowledged that law enforcement agencies had been working with incomplete information and had not been informed about the federal investigation that was proceeding simultaneously with their search efforts. The Sheriff's Department issued a statement expressing gratitude that the missing families had been safe throughout the past 20 years, while also acknowledging the frustration and pain that the secrecy had caused for community members who had been left without answers for so long. The developer who had purchased the shelter property announced plans to create a memorial garden on the site, recognizing both the families who had lived there and the sacrifice they had made in helping to expose corruption that had been stealing resources intended to help vulnerable populations. The memorial would include a plaque acknowledging Sarah Martinez's courage in investigating the financial irregularities that had ultimately led to the protection of the families under her care. The hidden room would be preserved as part of the memorial, serving as a reminder of the lengths to which people sometimes must go to protect the truth and ensure justice. Thompson reflected on how the resolution of the case had changed his perspective on law enforcement and the complexity of protecting public safety in situations involving organized crime and government corruption. The experience had taught him that sometimes the most important victories in criminal justice are ones that the public never learns about, and that protecting innocent people sometimes requires difficult decisions that can appear inexplicable to those who are not aware of all the relevant circumstances. The investigation into the hidden room and the documents found there led to the reopening of several related cases involving financial fraud and public corruption that had been considered closed. Federal prosecutors began reviewing whether additional charges could be filed against individuals who had participated in the scheme, though the passage of 20 years had complicated efforts to pursue some potential cases due to statutes of limitations and the deaths of several key witnesses. However, the new evidence provided insights into other corruption networks that might still be operating, leading to several ongoing investigations in multiple states. For the families who had been relocated, the public revelation of their story created both relief and new challenges. Many had built successful lives under their new identities and were concerned about how the publicity might affect their careers, their children's futures, and their safety. Federal authorities worked with each family individually to assess their security needs and to provide support for managing the transition to a more open existence. After 20 years of carefully maintained secrecy, some of the relocated individuals chose to return to Pennsylvania to visit the places they had been forced to leave behind, while others decided to maintain their new identities and continue living in the communities where they had built their adult lives. The federal government established a support program to help the families navigate the complex emotional and practical challenges of their unique situation, providing counseling services and legal assistance to those who needed help adjusting to their new circumstances. The case ultimately served as a reminder of the complex relationships between local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies, and the challenges that arise when different levels of government are working on related investigations without full coordination. It also highlighted the personal costs of criminal justice efforts and the difficult balance between protecting witnesses and providing closure for communities that are affected by unsolved cases. As Thompson approached retirement from his law enforcement career, he found satisfaction in knowing that his most challenging case had finally been resolved, even though the resolution had come in ways that no one could have anticipated. During those first confusing days in October 1996, when 23 people had simply vanished without explanation from a small shelter in rural Pennsylvania, the case had taught him valuable lessons about the complexity of criminal investigations and the importance of persistence in seeking truth, even when that truth proves to be more complicated than anyone could have imagined. The resolution of the Millbrook Family Shelter case became a defining moment in Thompson's career. demonstrating both the limitations and the potential of local law enforcement when working on cases that intersect with federal investigations. The experience influenced his approach to subsequent investigations and his understanding of the importance of interagency cooperation in addressing complex criminal enterprises that operate across multiple jurisdictions. The case also served as a powerful reminder that behind every missing persons investigation are real people whose lives have been disrupted by circumstances beyond their control, and that sometimes the most important work that law enforcement officers do is providing closure and answers to families who have been left to wonder about the fate of their loved ones. The 20-year mystery of the Millbrook Family Shelter had finally been solved, but its resolution raised new questions about the balance between security and transparency in criminal justice operations, and the long-term costs of protecting innocent people from the consequences of corruption and organized crime.